The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as much a part of the Iowa landscape as the drone of a two-cylinder John Deere in a distant field. It was late March 1972. The frost was just starting to leave the ground, leaving the farmyards a soupy mess of mud and melting snow. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint, greasy scent of old machinery. This was the Miller estate auction, old man Miller having finally succumbed to the lung ailment that had plagued him for a decade. Everything was going: the house, the land, the equipment. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my worn canvas jacket. My name is Calvin Miller, no relation to the family whose life was being sold off piece by piece. I was 26, farming the 240 acres my father had left me, and I felt older than my years. My own father had been a man who believed in two things: God and paying cash. He'd left me the land free and clear, along with a shed full of tired but honest iron. A Farmel M that had planted every crop since 1951, a John Deere 4020 that was the newest thing on the place, and a little Alice Chalmers all-crop pull-type combine that was getting harder and harder to find parts for. The auctioneer was working his way through the small stuff now: tools, chains, spare tires. The real show, the big tractors and the combine, was yet to come. I wasn't here for tractors. My 4020 was a good horse, strong and reliable. No, I was here for something else. Something I'd seen tucked away behind the main barn, half swallowed by overgrown thistle and burdock. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as the auctioneer's assistants used a big case tractor to drag it into the open. It was a monster, a Massey Ferguson 760 combine. When it was new, it had been the king of the field, a beast with a huge grain tank and a wide header that could swallow corn faster than any two men could crib it. But this one was a wreck. It sat listing to one side, its massive rear tire flat and cracked. The sheet metal was faded to a dull, chalky red, streaked with years of rust. A thick black stain ran down the side of the engine compartment, the telltale sign of a catastrophic failure. "All right, boys, here she is," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice cracking with feigned enthusiasm. "A real handyman special. We got a Massey Ferguson 760, Perkins diesel power. Or it was, anyway. The Miller boys said she threw a rod right out the side of the block last harvest. Their loss is your gain, perfect for parts or for the ambitious man. What'll you give me for it? Let's start the bidding at $500 for scrap. Who'll give me $500? Silence. The crowd of farmers, men with faces lined by sun and worry, just looked at it and shook their heads. A few chuckled. $500 was a lot for a trip to the scrapyard. Then a voice cut through the quiet, slick and confident. "I'll give you $50 for it, Earl. Might be able to use the seat cushion in my new 7700. The crowd laughed. It was Richard Sterling. Rich Sterling's family had always had more than anyone else in the county. More land, more money, and a whole lot more arrogance. While the rest of us were making do, Rich had just taken out a massive loan from the bank in town to buy the 320 acres next to his own place, and he'd equipped it with a brand new gleaming green line of John Deere machinery. His 7700 combine, with its air-conditioned cab and hydrostatic transmission, made my little pull-type look like a child's toy. Rich stood there, arms crossed over his chest, a smug grin on his face. He looked at me, his eyes lingering for a moment on my patched jacket and muddy boots, and then he looked back at the crippled Massey. He was the new king of the county, and he wanted everyone to know it. The auctioneer, Earl, just smiled. $50, Richard? You're all heart, but we need a serious bid. Who'll give me $200? $200 to haul her away." More silence. The wind picked up, rattling a loose piece of sheet metal on the combine's grain head. It sounded like a death rattle. I looked at the machine. I'd spent 2 hours looking it over the week before, poking and prodding while no one was around. Yes, the engine was shot. A connecting rod had let go and punched a fist-sized hole right through the side of the Perkins 354 block. The final drive on the left side was weeping oil, a bad seal at the very least. The belts were cracked. The wiring was a mouse-chewed nightmare, and the cab smelled of mildew and decay. But the frame was straight. The transmission seemed to shift through the gears, at least by hand. The big variable speed pulleys for the cylinder and fan weren't cracked, just rusted. The header, a 20-foot grain platform, was beat up but salvageable. It was a pile of junk, but it was a pile of well-made junk. And it was big. Big enough to handle my acreage and then some. $100, I said, my voice quiet but clear. Every head turned to look at me. Rich Sterling's grin widened into a sneer. Well, look what we have here. Scrap Iron Cal trying to build his empire. What's the matter, Cal? The Alice Chalmers finally give up the ghost? The nickname was new and it stung. But I kept my eyes on the auctioneer. $100 is the bid, I repeated. Earl looked surprised, but he was a professional. I got 100. Who'll give 150? 100. Do I hear 150? Rich just laughed out loud. Let him have it, Earl. He'll need something to keep him busy this winter. Better than him trying to farm with that museum collection his daddy left him. Sold, Earl's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. To Calvin Miller for $100. The crowd parted as I walked up to the auctioneer's table to pay my money. I could feel their eyes on my back, a mixture of pity and amusement. I handed Earl 5 crisp $20 bills from the roll I kept in my front pocket. It was most of the cash I had to my name. You got yourself a project, son, Earl said, his voice low, a big one. I know, I said, folding the receipt and tucking it away. As I turned to leave, Rich Sterling stepped in front of me, blocking my path. He was taller than me, softer. His hands were clean. $100, Cal. You could have bought a few good bags of seed corn for that, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. You gonna get that thing running in time for harvest? Or are you planning on cutting your beans with a pocket knife this year? I looked him square in the eye. I'll manage, Rich. Sure you will, he scoffed, stepping aside. Sure you will. Getting the Massey home was a bigger chore than buying it. I had to pay a neighbor with a lowboy trailer another $50 I couldn't afford to haul it the 5 miles to my farm. We winched it onto the trailer, the dead weight of it groaning and creaking. When we finally got it to my yard, we parked it next to my small machine shed, where it dwarfed everything I owned. It looked like a beached whale, dead and useless. For the first week, I did nothing but look at it. I'd finish my chores, pour a cup of coffee, and just walk circles around the thing. I pulled the engine side panels off and stared at the gaping hole in the block. I climbed into the dusty cab and sat in the cracked vinyl seat, imagining what it would feel like to command such a machine. Everyone in the county thought I was a fool. Rich Sterling was telling anyone who would listen that I'd finally cracked. They saw a pile of scrap, a monument to failure. But as I ran my hand over the cold, rusted steel, I saw something else. I saw potential. I saw a way to harvest my own crops, on my own time, without having to pay a custom harvester or rely on favors from neighbors. I saw a path to staying independent, to staying free of the banks that were sinking their teeth into men like Rich Sterling. It was a long shot, a damn near impossible one. The work ahead was staggering. Now, before we get into the grease and the busted knuckles of this rebuild, I gotta ask you folks watching this. Have you ever taken on a project that everyone, and I mean everyone, said was impossible? A car, a house, a business? Let me know down in the comments what it was, and tell me if you proved them all wrong. Because that's what I intended to do. The first step was the engine. The Perkins 354 was a good motor, used in thousands of tractors and combines, but this one was toast. The block was ruined, the crankshaft was likely bent from the force of the connecting rod letting go, and who knew what the cylinder head looked like? A new engine was out of the question. It would cost more than my whole farm was worth. A used one from a dealer was still thousands of dollars I didn't have. That left one option: the salvage yard. I spent the next 2 months on the phone. Back then, there was no internet. You had a phone, a stack of parts catalogs, and a list of salvage yards you'd written down over the years. I called yards in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, Missouri. Most of them laughed when I told them what I was looking for. A few had a Perkins 354, but they wanted a fortune for it, or it was in unknown condition. Finally, I got a lead from a yard down in southern Missouri. The old fella on the phone, a guy named Gus, said he had what I needed. Got an old white 2105 tractor that came in, he rasped through the phone line, rolled it over, cabs crushed, front axles snapped clean off. But the engine's cherry. Only had about 2,500 hours on it. Perkins 354, turbocharged. Turbocharged. The original engine in the Massey was naturally aspirated. A turbo would give it a little more power, a little more grunt for the tough spots. "How much you want for it?" I asked, holding my breath. "You come pull it yourself. I'll let you have it for $800, he said. $800. It might as well have been $1 million. I had about $200 in cash left to my name. I sold a few feeder calves I'd been planning to raise through the winter. That got me another $500. I was still short. I did the one thing my father had always told me never to do. I went to the bank, not for a loan, but to sell something. My father had left me 5 shares of stock in the local co-op, a rainy day fund he'd tucked away. I sold them to the bank manager, Mr. Henderson, for $150. I was scraping the bottom of the barrel. The next Saturday, I hooked my old gooseneck trailer to my neighbor's Ford F-250, a favor I'd repay with a week of fixing his fences, and made the 10-hour drive down to Missouri. Gus's salvage yard was a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of iron. Rusting tractors, combines, and plows were arranged in long, crooked rows, their parts picked clean like skeletons. Gus was a wiry old man with grease permanently embedded in the lines of his hands. He pointed me toward the wrecked white tractor. "She's all yours," he said, and left me to it. It took me 2 full days of brutal, back-breaking work. I used a set of chain hoists I'd brought with me, slung over the loader arms of Gus's old payloader. I fought with rusted bolts, greasy fuel lines, and wiring harnesses that seemed to wrap around everything. The sun beat down on my back, and sweat dripped into my eyes, stinging them with salt. By the end of the second day, the Turbo Perkins was sitting on a pallet on my trailer, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest. Back home, the real work began. The new engine was just the start. I had to swap the flywheel and bell housing from the old Massey engine to make it fit the combine's transmission. I spent a week in my dimly lit shop, a single bare bulb hanging from the rafters, carefully cleaning, measuring, and fitting the parts. The smell of diesel and degreaser hung heavy in the air. While the engine was out, I tackled the rest of the machine. I started at the front with the header. I pulled it into the shop and disassembled it completely. The sickle bar was a mess of broken and bent sections. I replaced every single one, my hands aching from running the rivet gun. I welded cracks in the auger flighting and straightened the reel bats with a sledgehammer and a rosebud torch. Then came the guts of the combine. I crawled inside the belly of the beast, a space no bigger than a coffin, and inspected the straw walkers. 2 of the wooden bearings were shot. I couldn't buy new ones, so I made them. I bought a block of hard maple from the lumberyard and spent 2 nights shaping them with a rasp and sandpaper until they were a perfect fit, just like the originals. I soaked them in oil for a week before I installed them. The community watched my slow, painful progress. Cars would slow down as they passed my farmstead, the drivers rubbernecking to see the state of the dissected monster in my yard. The talk at the co-op was that I was wasting my time and money. Rich Sterling, of course, was the loudest voice. "Heard Cal Miller is trying to whittle himself a new combine out of a block of wood," he'd say, and the old-timers sitting around the coffee pot would chuckle. It was isolating work. Spring planting came, and I put the combine project on hold to get my corn and beans in the ground with the old Farmall M. The planter was a 4-row, slow and steady. I watched Rich Sterling's brand new John Deere 16-row planter fly across his fields, doing in a day what took me a week. He'd drive by in his pickup, give a little toot of the horn, and a wave that was more of a mockery than a greeting. Summer was a blur of cultivating, spraying, and working on the combine every spare minute I had. Nights were the worst. I'd be in the shop until 2 in the morning, wrestling with a hydraulic line or trying to decipher a faded wiring diagram in a greasy shop manual I'd found. I'd fall into bed, exhausted and covered in grime, only to get up 4 hours later to do it all over again. There were times I wanted to quit. Times I stood in front of that mountain of iron and felt completely overwhelmed, a fool who'd bet everything on a losing hand. But then I'd think of Rich Sterling's smug face or the pitying looks from my neighbors, and a stubborn pride would well up inside me. I would not fail. I would not give them the satisfaction. By the fall of 1973, nearly 2 years after I'd dragged the scrap heap home, it was starting to look like a combine again. The Perkins engine was nestled in the frame, plumbed and wired. I'd replaced dozens of belts, hundreds of feet of hydraulic hose, and what felt like 1,000 bolts. I'd patched rust holes in the sheet metal with scraps of tin and a can of Bondo. I didn't have money for paint, so it was a patchwork of faded red, primer grey, and rust. It was ugly, but it was solid. The day I first tried to start it, my heart was pounding in my chest. I'd bled the fuel lines, checked the oil, and put a fresh battery in it. I climbed into the cab, turned the key, and hit the starter button. The engine turned over slowly, groaning. Once, twice, 3 times. It coughed a thick plume of black smoke from the exhaust stack. I tried again. It cranked, and then, with a shudder and a roar, it caught. The big Perkins diesel thundered to life. The whole machine vibrated with power. The sound was deafening, beautiful. I sat there for a full minute, just listening to it run, a wide grin spreading across my face. It was the sound of victory. That harvest was the Massey's first trial. It wasn't easy. A hydraulic line blew on the first day, spraying hot oil all over the side of the machine. A bearing went out on the clean grain elevator, and I spent half a night replacing it by the light of a trouble light. It was slow, and it was loud, and the cab was dusty and hot. But it worked. I cut every acre of my corn and soybeans with that machine. When the last bushel was in the bin, I felt a sense of accomplishment I'd never known. I had done it. I had taken a pile of scrap and turned it into a harvest. And the best part? It was all mine. Paid for. I didn't owe a dime to anyone. The next few years settled into a rhythm. The early 1970s were a boom time for farmers. The massive grain deal with the Soviet Union had sent prices through the roof. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz was on the radio telling everyone to get big, or get out, to plant fence-row to fence-row. A wave of optimism, bordering on euphoria, swept through the heartland. Rich Sterling rode that wave higher than anyone. The money was rolling in, and he spent it as fast as it came. He traded in his 2-year-old John Deere 7700 for the brand new 8820, a titan of a machine that made my old Massey look like a toy. He bought another 160 acres that came up for sale, leveraging his existing land to get the loan. He tore down his family's old farmhouse and built a sprawling new brick ranch-style house with a 2-car garage. He bought a new Lincoln for his wife and a new Chevy Silverado for himself. He was the very picture of the modern, successful American farmer, and the bankers loved him. They couldn't throw money at him fast enough. At the diner, he'd hold court, talking about expansion and tax credits and depreciation. "You gotta spend money to make money, boys," he'd say, clapping some older, more cautious farmer on the back. "Land values are only going one way, up. You'd be a fool not to buy all you can right now." He'd sometimes look over at me, sitting by myself in a corner booth with a cup of coffee. "Cal, here, he's got the right idea," Rich would say with a wink, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "He's saving his money. Pretty soon he'll have enough to buy a whole can of paint for that museum piece of his." The room would fill with laughter. The nickname had stuck. I was Scrap Iron Cal, the eccentric young farmer who was too stubborn or too stupid to get on the gravy train. I ignored them. The high grain prices were good for me too, but I saw them differently. My father had seen the good times of the 50s give way to the lean years of the 60s. He'd always said, "Good times don't last, son, but the bills always do." His words echoed in my mind. Instead of buying new land or new equipment, I used the extra money to build a fortress. I paid off the last small operating note my father had left on the farm. I took the old single-car garage and, with concrete blocks and lumber I bought for cash, I expanded it into a proper 2-bay heated workshop. I bought a heavy-duty lathe and a milling machine at an industrial auction. I built up a stockpile of filters, belts, and bearings for all my old equipment. And every month, I took what was left and put it in a simple savings account at the bank. I wasn't building an empire of acres. I was building an empire of independence. My neighbors thought I was crazy. "What are you doing, Cal?" one of them asked me at the feed mill one day. "You could buy that 80 acres down the road from you. Henderson at the bank would give you the loan in a heartbeat." "I don't like loans," I told him. He just shook his head and walked away, muttering something about me being as tight-fisted as my old man. I didn't care. I was sleeping soundly at night. My harvest costs were a fraction of my neighbors'. My biggest expense was fuel. While they were sweating over massive loan payments that were tied to fluctuating interest rates, my only payments were to myself. The old Massey, which I'd nicknamed the Phoenix, wasn't pretty, but it was reliable now. I knew every bolt and every belt on it. When something broke, I could usually fix it myself with parts I had on hand in my new shop. By the late 1970s, the world was changing. The oil crisis sent fuel prices soaring. Inflation, a word most farmers only heard on the national news, was starting to become a real problem. The cost of everything, seed, fertilizer, parts, was going up. To fight it, the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates. At first, it was just a little bit. 1/4 point here, 1/2 point there. I was at the bank one afternoon in the fall of '79, depositing a check from the grain elevator, when I saw Rich Sterling talking with Mr. Henderson, the bank president. Rich wasn't smiling his usual confident smile. His face was tight with worry. "Paul, you can't be serious," Rich was saying, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "My operating note is coming due, and you're telling me the rate is going from 9% to 12%. That's a huge jump." Mr. Henderson looked uncomfortable. He was a good man, but he was a banker. "My hands are tied, Rich. It's the prime rate. It's going up everywhere. We have to adjust." "But 12%, Rich exclaimed. That's thousands of extra dollars I hadn't planned on." I finished my transaction and walked out of the bank, the sound of Rich's panicked voice fading behind me. As I climbed into my old pickup truck, I looked across the street. Rich's shiny new Silverado was parked there. It was a beautiful truck, but I knew what he didn't seem to understand. He didn't really own it. The bank did. The bank owned his tractors, his combine, his new house, and his land. He was just borrowing it all. And the rent was about to go up. A dark cloud was gathering on the horizon, and I had a feeling the easy times were coming to an end. The storm was coming, and I was one of the few farmers in the county who had his harvest safely in the barn. The whisper that had started at the bank in '79 became a roar by the fall of 1981. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, had cranked interest rates up to levels that seemed impossible. 12% looked like a bargain now. The prime rate flirted with 20%, then 21%. Every farmer with a variable rate loan, which was nearly every farmer who had expanded in the '70s, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his gut with each new broadcast from the evening news. The other shoe dropped when the grain embargo against the Soviet Union, a political move made in a distant capital, sent crop prices into a freefall. Suddenly, the math no longer worked. The same bushel of corn that had comfortably serviced a loan payment a few years ago now barely covered the fuel it took to harvest it. Land values, which had been inflated by the boom and used as collateral for every new loan, began to plummet. The foundation of the entire agricultural economy was cracking. I saw the change in the faces at the co-op. The confident talk of expansion was gone, replaced by hushed, worried conversations about cash flow and refinancing. Men who had been driving new pickups were now nursing their old farm trucks back to life. The optimism of the '70s had curdled into a quiet, simmering panic. Rich Sterling felt the squeeze harder than most. He had more debt, more acres, more payments than anyone. The brand new John Deere 8820, his pride and joy, became his albatross. One day during soybean harvest, I saw it sitting silent in the middle of one of his biggest fields, a green island in a sea of gold. A white dealer service truck was parked beside it. I learned later what had happened. A sophisticated electronic sensor in the hydrostatic transmission had failed. It wasn't a part you could fix with a wrench and a welder. The onboard computer, designed to make the machine smarter, had simply shut the entire combine down. The dealer mechanic had to come out from the city, 60 miles away. He spent 4 hours diagnosing the problem with a special computer terminal he plugged into the combine's wiring harness. The part itself, a little black box no bigger than a deck of cards, had to be ordered from a regional warehouse in Moline, Illinois. It cost $600. The service call, including mileage and labor, was another $500. For 3 perfect sunny harvest days, Rich's $500,000 combine sat useless while his soybeans waited in the field. That same week, a shaft bearing on the Phoenix's main cylinder drive failed. It was a loud grinding failure that brought my own harvest to a sudden halt. But I didn't have to make a phone call. I walked back to my shop, found the part number in my old Massey Ferguson manual, and pulled a new bearing, still in its greasy cardboard box, from the steel shelves I'd built. It was a part I'd bought 5 years earlier for $7. It took me 3 hours of hard, grimy work with a gear puller and a press, but by sundown, the old Perkins diesel was thundering again, and I was back in the field, cutting beans under the moonlight. The total cost of my breakdown was $7 and a few hours of my own sweat. The cracks in Rich's empire started to show. He sold his herd of feeder cattle at a loss just to make an interest payment. The shiny Lincoln his wife drove was replaced by a used Ford station wagon. He stopped holding court at the diner. When I saw him, his face was pale and drawn, his eyes carrying a haunted look I recognized. It was the look of a man trapped, the walls closing in around him. He cornered me one day at the parts store. I was buying a new set of sickle sections. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Cal," he said, his voice raspy, I need some help." I was surprised. He'd never asked me for anything but a hard time. "What is it, Rich?" "It's the 8820, he said, looking down at the floor. "The final drive. It's leaking bad. The dealer says it's the main bull gear seal. They want $6,000 to split the machine and replace it." $6,000. I don't have it. He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading. "I heard you have a lathe, a press." I was wondering, could you... He couldn't finish the sentence. The humiliation was too much. He, Rich Sterling, the king of modern farming, was asking Scrap Iron Cal for help fixing his state-of-the-art machine because he couldn't afford the dealer. "Bring the parts over to my shop tonight," I said quietly. "We'll take a look at it." That night, under the bare bulbs of my workshop, we pulled the massive planetary final drive apart on my workbench. The problem was just what the dealer said it was: a hardened steel seal that had failed. But after cleaning it up, I saw the shaft it rode on was scored, a tiny groove worn into the metal. A new seal would fail again in 100 hours. "The dealer would replace the whole shaft," I said, running my finger over the groove. "That's where most of the cost is." Rich just stared at it, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "So it's hopeless?" "No," I said, turning to my lathe. "It's not." I spent the next 4 hours at the lathe, carefully turning the shaft down just a few thousandths of an inch to remove the groove. Then, using a piece of hardened steel stock, I machined a new sleeve, a press-fit ring that would restore the shaft to its original diameter. It was a slow, precise process, the kind of old-world repair that a modern dealership, focused on replacing parts rather than fixing them, would never even attempt. We pressed the new sleeve on, installed a standard $20 seal, and put the whole unit back together. When we were done, Rich tried to offer me money. His hand trembled as he pulled a crumpled wad of bills from his pocket. "Keep it," I told him, wiping the grease from my hands with a rag. "Just get your crop in." He stood there for a moment in the dim light, his face a mixture of gratitude and shame. He just nodded, unable to speak, and left. He had his combine running again, but we both knew it was just a finger in a dike that was about to burst. By 1983, the crisis was a full-blown catastrophe. The local paper was filled with foreclosure notices. Farm auctions became a weekly, heartbreaking ritual. They were grim affairs. The crowds were small and quiet, neighbors watching as a friend's entire life was sold off to the highest bidder. The big city bankers would stand at the back, clipboards in hand, tallying up the proceeds that would never be enough to cover the loans. The air was thick with a sense of failure and despair. I survived because I was invisible to the bankers. I owed them nothing. My land, my house, my machinery, it was all mine. When fertilizer prices doubled, I cut back on my application rates and took a small hit on my yield. When fuel prices soared, I spent more time tuning the old diesel engines on my tractors, making sure they were running as efficiently as possible. I wasn't making much money, but my costs were so low that I was still in the black. My savings account, the one I had been building for years, acted as a buffer, a seawall against the economic storm. The day I saw the notice for the sterling auction, my heart sank. It wasn't a feeling of triumph or vindication, it was a profound sadness. It listed everything: the John Deere 8820, the 4840 and 4640 tractors, the 16-row planter, the brand new brick house, and 640 acres of prime Iowa farmland. An entire world, built on a foundation of borrowed money, was about to be washed away. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a typical late November day that matched the mood of the crowd. The auctioneer's chant, which had sounded so exciting and full of promise at the Miller sale a decade earlier, now sounded like a funeral dirge. I saw Rich standing near the house his father had built, and he had torn down. He was a ghost, his face hollow, his eyes vacant. His wife stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off the chill, though the cold was coming from within. The machinery went first. The 8820, which had cost Rich over $150,000 just a few years before, sold for $40,000 to an investment group from Chicago. The tractors, the planter, the tillage equipment, it all went for a fraction of its value, bought up by bargain hunters and corporate farm representatives. With each crack of the gavel, I could see Rich flinch, another piece of his identity stripped away. I didn't bid on any of it. My own shed was full of machinery that I owned, that I understood. I didn't need newer, more complicated problems. While the auctioneer was selling off the household goods, I walked away from the crowd and over to my old pickup. I sat there for a long time, watching the proceedings from a distance. I thought about that day, so long ago, when Rich had stood with his arms crossed, a smug grin on his face, and called me Scrap Iron Cal. He had seen me as a relic, a stubborn fool clinging to the past. He couldn't have known that the past was the only thing that could survive the future they were all rushing toward. My survival was quiet. While my neighbors were losing their farms, I was picking up work. The Phoenix, my ugly patched-together combine, became a lifeline for some. When a neighbor's newer machine broke down and they couldn't afford the repair bill, I would come over and finish their fields for them. I didn't ask for cash. They didn't have any. We bartered. I took a share of the crop, or they helped me put up hay, or their son would spend a week helping me fix fences. We were going back to an older way of doing things, a system built on community and mutual trust, not banknotes and interest rates. I wasn't getting rich, but my bins were full, and my neighbors were able to hold on for another season. I was an anchor in a sea of chaos. The final item to be sold at Rich's auction was the land itself. It was offered in parcels. The big out-of-state investment groups bought up the prime, flat ground, the sections Rich had bought during the boom. Their representatives, men in clean suits and polished shoes, bid with calm, detached efficiency. They were buying assets for a portfolio, not a family's heritage. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel. All right, folks, next up we have the home place. The original 160 acres, with the house, the barns, and the grain bins. A beautiful farmstead. What am I bid? This was the heart of it all, the land Rich's grandfather had homesteaded, the ground where he had grown up. Rich stood there, his wife holding his hand, his face a mask of anguish as he watched his birthright being sold. The bidding started low. The corporate buyers weren't as interested in this parcel. The house and buildings were a liability to them. A few local farmers made hesitant bids, but they were stretched thin themselves. The bidding stalled. The auctioneer tried to coax it higher. Folks, this is a good piece of ground, a fine home, a place to raise a family. Do I have another bid? Silence. The grey sky seemed to press down on us all. I saw Mr. Henderson, the banker, talking to one of the investors in the suit. A deal was about to be made. The homestead would be gone, swallowed by a faceless corporation. I thought of my father. I thought of his belief in paying cash, in owning what was yours. I thought of the years I had spent saving, pinching pennies, enduring the jokes and the pitying looks. I had been saving for a rainy day, and outside a cold, miserable rain was beginning to fall. I got out of my truck and walked to the edge of the crowd. I bid 100,000, I said, my voice clear and steady. Every head turned. Rich Sterling stared at me, his mouth agape. The man in the suit looked irritated, his quiet deal disrupted. Mr. Henderson, the banker, looked at me with stunned surprise. The investor conferred with his partner, then raised his hand. 105. I didn't hesitate. 110. I had spent years preparing for this moment, though I had never known what it would be. I knew exactly how much cash I had in my savings account. I knew my limit. The man in the suit looked at me, sizing me up. He saw a man in a worn canvas jacket and muddy boots. He saw a small-time farmer. He shook his head dismissively and bid again. 115. 120, I said immediately. My voice didn't waver. We went back and forth, the price climbing in $5,000 increments. The crowd was silent, watching the duel. It was the past versus the future, the tortoise versus the hare. When the bidding reached $150,000, the investor paused. He looked at the house, at the old barns. He did the math on his clipboard. It was no longer a bargain. He shook his head at the auctioneer. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the heavy air, to Calvin Miller for $150,000. A quiet gasp went through the crowd. I had just spent nearly every dollar I had saved in my life. I walked up to the clerk's table and wrote a check, my hand steady. As I turned, I saw Rich. He was looking at me, his eyes filled with a confusion so deep it was painful to see. He thought I had come to gloat, to deliver the final killing blow. I walked over to him. His wife looked away, tears streaming down her face. "Rich," I said, my voice low so only he could hear. "This is still your home." He blinked, not understanding. "What?" "The house, the barns," I said. "I don't need them. You and your family can stay, live here. You can rent it from me." I don't have any money, Cal. I can't pay you rent." "The rent is $1 a year," I said. "And a promise. Teach your son what you learned. Teach him the difference between what a man is worth and what a bank says he's worth." He stared at me, his jaw working but no words coming out. The hard mask of pride he had worn for so many years finally crumbled, and he broke down, sobbing like a child. He, the man who had mocked me, who had called me a fool, was now standing on land that I owned, being offered a kindness he had never shown to anyone. It wasn't about revenge. It was about preserving something. It was about community. It was about proving that my father's way, the slow, steady, honest way, was not just about survival, but about grace. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis eventually receded, leaving behind a landscape forever changed. Many families were gone, their land consolidated into massive corporate holdings. But some of us, the stubborn ones, the ones who had been cautious, remained. The nickname Scrap Iron Cal stuck, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer an insult, it became a title of respect. When a neighbor's old tractor broke down, they'd say, "Better go see Scrap Iron Cal, he'll know how to fix it." My workshop became an unofficial community center, a place where men could come not just for a welded part or a rebuilt carburetor, but for advice and a reminder that new and shiny wasn't always better than old and reliable. Rich and I farmed side by side. He worked the homestead, and I worked my original ground. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. We never became close friends, but a deep, unspoken understanding grew between us. We were two sides of the same coin, two men who had learned the same lesson from opposite ends of fortune. By the early 1990s, I had a son of my own, a boy with my wife's bright eyes and my stubborn chin. I taught him how to drive the old Farmall M, his small hands barely able to grip the big steering wheel. I taught him how to change the oil in the 40/20, and one day, when he was old enough, I took him out to the machine shed and pulled the tarp off the Phoenix. It was faded and dented, a patchwork of welds and primer. It looked ancient next to the newer combines in the neighbors' fields. "This machine," I told him, laying a hand on the cool red metal, "is the reason we're still here. It looks like junk, but it's not. It's freedom. It's the harvest we owned, not the one we rented." He ran his small hand over a large, greasy bolt on the final drive. "Did you fix this, Dad?" I smiled, remembering that night in the shop with Rich. "I did," I said. "Sometimes, son, the most valuable things aren't the ones you buy. They're the ones you save." We climbed up into the dusty cab together. I turned the key and the old Perkins 354 diesel roared to life, the whole machine shuddering with the same raw, honest power I'd felt all those years ago. The sound echoed across the yard, a deep, rumbling testament to resilience. It wasn't the sound of wealth or power. It was the sound of a debt-free harvest, the sound of a life built not on the shifting sands of credit, but on the solid rock of your own two hands. And as I looked out over the fields that were truly mine, with my son beside me, I knew it was the most beautiful sound in the world.